In the heart of Afghanistan's Helmand province lies a forsaken outpost, its name spoken in hushed tones among those who have felt its chilling grip. Observation Point Rock, a place where the past's tormented whispers permeate the present, and where the line between the living and the departed is hauntingly fragile. Once a strategic vantage point, OP Rock now stands as a testament to forgotten horrors, its stones steeped in tales that defy reason. Those who have been stationed here recount experiences that gnaw at the edges of sanity, whispers in the night, spectral lights dancing across the horizon, and an unshakable sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Local legends speak of rebels buried alive during missile strikes, their souls forever tethered to the rock, seeking vengeance for their untimely demise. Could these tales hold the key to understanding the malevolent forces that haunt OP Rock? Or are they mere fabrications, born from the minds of those driven to madness by the horrors they've witnessed? As we delve into the mysteries of Observation Point Rock, we uncover not just the experiences of soldiers, but the very essence of human belief, fear, and the unyielding grip of history. Join us on a journey into the heart of darkness, as we seek answers to questions that have lingered for decades. In the unforgiving expanse of Afghanistan's Helmand province stands a solitary outpost known as Observation Point Rock or OP Rock. Its commanding elevation offers an unparalleled vantage over the surrounding valleys, making it a coveted strategic asset for military forces throughout the region's tumultuous history. The significance of OP Rock extends beyond its natural defenses. Archaeological remnants suggest a history spanning centuries, with fortifications dating back to medieval times. Some scholars trace its origins even further, proposing connections to the era of Alexander the Great. During the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s, OP Rock was transformed into a formidable military installation. Soviet forces recognized its strategic value, establishing a base to monitor and control the surrounding regions. In 1986, a Soviet platoon was deployed to reinforce the position. Tragically, this unit met a harrowing end, with reports suggesting that the entire platoon was lost under mysterious and violent circumstances. The legacy of OP Rock's strategic importance continued into the 21st century. In 2008, NATO forces, led by U.S. Marines, seized control of the outpost from Taliban insurgents. The operation was marked by intense combat, resulting in numerous casualties on both sides. Upon securing the position, NATO forces discovered remnants of previous occupants, including Soviet-era equipment and Taliban insignia, underscoring the site's tumultuous past. Throughout its existence, OP Rock has been more than a mere military outpost. It's a nexus where history, strategy, and the supernatural intertwine. Its elevated position has not only provided a strategic advantage but has also made it a silent witness to the ebb and flow of empires and conflicts. Imagine this: a brutal landscape, the air thick with gunpowder and dust. The ground beneath you, scarred, marred by the endless violence that has plagued this place for decades. The Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s wasn't just a battle for territory. It was a fight for survival. The Soviet soldiers sent into this unforgiving land never understood the true nature of the enemy they would face. It wasn't just the mujahideen they had to worry about. It was the land itself. The earth seemed to hunger for blood, ravenous, unyielding. Clashes between Soviet forces and the mujahideen were relentless. The Soviet army, armed with superior technology, was confident in its might. Yet they couldn't overcome the cunning of their Afghan adversaries. The mujahideen, utilizing guerrilla tactics, turned the land into a deadly trap, drawing Soviet troops into its grasp. The night would echo with the sounds of combat, gunfire, the explosion of grenades, the screams of men falling in their prime. The Soviets suffered heavy losses. But it wasn't just the blood spilled in the daylight hours that troubled the men who served here. It was the sounds that filled the night. Whispers on the wind. Shadows darting between the ruins. Soldiers, exhausted and paranoid, often claimed to hear footsteps behind them in the dark. They spoke of cold, unseen hands reaching out from the earth. Some were so unnerved they fled, abandoning their posts in the dead of night. Many of the Soviet soldiers never left the battlefield. Their bodies were often left behind, forgotten in the chaos of war. And those who survived? They were forever marked by the things they saw here. Some said that when the wind howled through the ruins, it wasn't just the sound of the desert moving. It was the sound of the souls of the fallen, restless, trapped within the valley's grasp. But not all of the souls were content to remain in the dust. There were whispers of things seen by the men who came after. Rumors of those same Soviet soldiers wandering the rocky terrain at night, their eyes hollow, their faces twisted in agony. But there were more than just soldiers on this cursed land. The Mujahideen, too, met their bloody end, their bodies buried deep beneath the earth they fought so fiercely to protect. As time passed, NATO troops took over the post, their arrival marking yet another chapter in this cursed place's history. But they too would feel the weight of those restless spirits. Stories began to circulate about inexplicable events. Soldiers heard footsteps, felt cold gusts of wind with no source, and saw fleeting glimpses of figures in the shadows. Each time, the figure vanished before anyone could approach. And sometimes, just sometimes, there were those who swore they could hear whispers in their ears. Soft, faint, like a plea for help. Or worse, a warning. The discovery came on a routine patrol. As the soldiers ventured deeper into the ruins of OP Rock, they unearthed something that made even the bravest among them falter. The bones of soldiers, both Soviet and Mujahideen, long forgotten by history, were uncovered, as though the earth itself had been forced to reveal its secrets. With each unearthed skull, the temperature seemed to drop, and those who found them felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over them. The hairs on the back of their necks would stand up, and a thick, suffocating silence would descend. Some believe these remains marked the final resting place of warriors whose spirits could never find peace. Perhaps it was the violence, the hatred, the blood spilled. Or perhaps the land itself had become a beacon for those lost souls, guiding them to the place where they had fought and died. And so, with each discovery, the mystery grew. Were these the souls of the fallen, trapped in the land they died defending? Or were they simply victims of the endless cycle of war, caught in the web of history, doomed to haunt the place that had witnessed their final moments? Whatever it was clear that Observation Point Rock was not a place to be taken lightly. The echoes of the fallen were not just remnants of the past. They were warnings. It was supposed to be a routine deployment, another mission in the long line of military operations across Afghanistan. But for the Welsh Guards, this was anything but ordinary. Their arrival at Observation Point Rock marked the beginning of something they could not, and perhaps would not, ever explain. They had seen the reports, the whispers of soldiers before them, the strange stories, but in their minds they dismissed it as superstition, as something only the weak gave attention to. But nothing prepared them for what they would face in those barren hills. The first signs came quickly, too quickly to ignore. It wasn't the heat, nor the harsh terrain that unsettled them. No, it was the sounds. At first it was barely noticeable, soft like whispers. They would hear it in the dead of night, when the moon cast long shadows across the jagged rocks. Voices unintelligible but unmistakably human. Coming from nowhere. Coming from everywhere. And then came the figures. Soldiers who stood guard late into the night began to report seeing shadows darting across the ruins. At first, they thought it was the trick of their tired eyes, the shadows cast by the flickering light of their campfires. But the sightings persisted. No matter where they went in the outpost, no matter how many times they checked their surroundings, the shadows would appear. They weren't human, not in the way you'd expect. These were figures without shape, dark against the moonlight, slipping in and out of sight like phantoms. No one dared approach them. By the time the weeks passed, the psychological toll began to mount. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. Some of the soldiers even swore they could hear their names being called in the dark as though someone, something, knew them. It was subtle at first. A voice here, a touch there. But as time wore on, it grew impossible to ignore. The men started to lose their focus. Patrols became erratic, soldiers started snapping at each other over nothing. The thin fabric of their discipline began to unravel. As the days turned into weeks, the soldiers' spirits began to fracture. They no longer spoke of the whispers or the shadows openly. But it was clear to all of them that the fear had taken hold. Some soldiers claimed they felt cold drafts in the midst of the hottest days. Others spoke of strange sounds at night, like someone walking just behind them. No one dared to go out alone anymore. And when they did, the paranoia was almost tangible. Morale began to plummet. The soldiers weren't just battling the enemy anymore. They were battling something far more insidious. An enemy they couldn't see but could feel pressing in on them from all sides. Their nerves were shot. They jumped at the slightest noise. Even the smallest creak of a floorboard or the shifting of the wind would send them into a frenzy. Their ability to fight effectively began to deteriorate. How could you fight an enemy you couldn't even see? And when you couldn't trust your own mind anymore, what hope did you have of surviving? The Welsh Guards were trained to endure the worst. But there, in that cursed outpost, it wasn't the enemy that would break them, it was the creeping doubt that gnawed at their sanity. Every whisper, every shadow, every fleeting glimpse of something, someone that wasn't supposed to be there chipped away at their resolve. Until finally, the voices that had once been whispers became clear. They were no longer distant. They were in the very walls of Observation Point Rock. And they were demanding attention. One soldier, who had been stationed alone in a remote part of the post, claimed to have heard the voice of his mother calling his name in the dead of night. He ran through the dark, heart pounding in his chest, only to find nothing. But the voice? The voice lingered. His comrades swore he had never been the same after that. The look in his eyes was different, hollow, as if he had seen something beyond comprehension. July 2009. 8 young men arrived at Observation Point Rock for what was supposed to be a routine 60-day mission. To them, it seemed like just another deployment, one more outpost to guard. Nothing more, nothing less. But by the time they left, those 60 days would haunt them forever. What they encountered there couldn't be explained, and no amount of training could prepare them for the overwhelming terror that would take hold of them. At first, everything seemed fine, too fine. The first few days, the Marines settled into their routine without incident. They secured the perimeter, set up their posts, and began their patrols. Yet something about the outpost felt different, as if the very ground they stood on was waiting for something. They had heard rumors of strange occurrences at Observation Point Rock. But like most soldiers, they chalked it up to superstition, something to laugh about around a campfire. They couldn't have been more wrong. Nightfall brought with it an unsettling change. The first voices came on the 4th night. Soft, barely audible whispers at first, so faint that the men thought they were imagining things. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, clearer. Words, sentences, spoken in languages none of them recognized. The Marines, trained for the worst, tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind playing tricks, maybe the sound of distant voices carried on the air. But none of them could shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was there, waiting in the darkness. Then the lights came. At first, they thought it was a mirage, some optical illusion caused by the harsh desert winds and the heat. But the lights didn't vanish with the morning. They flickered in the distance, pale blue lights that danced in the corners of their vision, just beyond reach. The Marines tried to track them, but no matter how hard they focused, the lights moved faster than they could follow. Some claimed the lights seemed to mock them, drifting just out of view before vanishing into the empty night. As the days dragged on, the temperature became unbearable. The heat was intense during the day, but at night, the temperature dropped without warning, plummeting to levels that defied natural explanation. They couldn't explain it. One minute, the air was dry and scorching. The next, it was freezing cold like a draft coming from nowhere. The Marines huddled together for warmth, but nothing could protect them from the biting cold that seemed to seep into their very bones. And then came the smell. It wasn't the scent of dust or decay you would expect from an isolated outpost in the desert. No, this was something different, something wrong. It was the stench of death, rotting flesh, an odor so strong that some of the Marines gagged. They searched high and low for the source but found nothing. No carcasses, no animals, no dead bodies. Just that overwhelming smell that clung to the air, seeping into their clothes, their skin, their very minds. As the days wore on, the presence became more oppressive. The men began to feel it, the weight of unseen eyes upon them. The feeling that they were being watched, always watched. They could hear their own hearts racing in their chests, the quickened beats amplified by the silence. But no matter how many times they looked over their shoulders, there was nothing there. Yet the sensation never left. The atmosphere had become unbearable. There were moments when the Marines would sit in the dark, clutching their rifles, eyes wide, as if the mere act of looking would draw something toward them. And the whispers, always there. Sometimes they would catch bits of their own names or the names of others who had never been there. The voices were everywhere, and no one could tell who or what they belonged to. As the mission drew to a close, the Marines left the outpost. Physically they were the same, but mentally they were forever changed. They had seen things they could not explain, felt things they couldn't describe, and most importantly, those who had been there, who had lived through it, would never forget the feeling that something ancient, was waiting at Observation Point Rock. A feeling that no amount of time or distance could ever erase. Some things don't leave you when you walk away. And the effects, well, they don't always show up on the surface. After the Marines had left Observation Point Rock, they weren't the same. Not in any sense. You could look at them, see their eyes, and know that something had changed, something they couldn't put into words. But the toll? That was much deeper, much darker. When you talk to military psychologists, the first thing they'll tell you is that the mind is a fragile thing. Stress, fear, isolation. When mixed with the unexplainable, they create an environment where reality itself becomes an enemy. The whispers, the lights, the cold, the stench, they were never just anomalies. They were the cracks in the foundation of the mind. And for the men at Observation Point Rock, those cracks deepened into something far more damaging than anyone could anticipate. Psychologists explain that prolonged exposure to stress, especially in a combat environment, alters the way the brain processes information. When soldiers begin encountering the unexplainable, the mind doesn't always know how to react. The lines between reality and hallucination blur, and what was once tangible now feels uncertain. The desert air, once warm and comforting, began to feel suffocating. The soldiers began to question their own senses, unable to trust what they saw, what they heard, what they felt. The mind, in its need to protect itself, tries to rationalize. It clings to logic, to structure, even when the world around it defies understanding. But no amount of reasoning could silence the whispers. No amount of training could explain the lights. And the cold? It wasn't the kind of cold that could be dismissed by science. So what did they do? They rationalized. They convinced themselves it was just the stress, just the exhaustion, just the heat playing tricks on them. They ignored what they couldn't explain as best they could. But it wasn't enough. As the days stretched on, the coping mechanisms shifted from reason to denial. They became masters of self-deception, of pretending it wasn't happening, of pretending that the environment around them wasn't changing them. But how long can a person hold on to reality when the very fabric of that reality is constantly being questioned? How long before the mind begins to break or worse, adapt to the unexplainable? The mind, they say, is capable of extraordinary things. But sometimes, it holds on to memories and experiences that go beyond the capacity for understanding. When you're caught in a place that defies explanation, where the rules of nature no longer seem to apply, the mind doesn't just break. It shifts. The soldiers at Observation Point Rock weren't just confronting fear. They were confronting something beyond fear itself. And when the mind doesn't have the answers, it begins to create its own. They learned too late that not everything could be outrun. The psychological toll, the weight of what they had seen and experienced, was something that no one could fully comprehend unless they lived through it. And when they left that place, they carried it with them, like a ghost that wouldn't leave them, a shadow that would never fade. Out in the desert, where the land stretches like an endless sea of sand and the sky above feels both too close and impossibly distant, it's easy to forget that your mind is still a part of this harsh, unforgiving world. For the soldiers at Observation Point Rock, the isolation of the landscape became just another part of the oppressive atmosphere. But could it be that what they were experiencing, those haunting sights, those unnerving sounds, could be explained by something more mundane than the supernatural? When you're out there, away from everything, when the only sound is the wind and the occasional echo of distant gunfire, the mind does strange things. Sleep deprivation alone is enough to distort your perception. Experts say it's not just the body that suffers when you lose sleep. It's the mind that starts to twist reality, pulling in fragments of thoughts and memories into a disorienting mosaic. A shadow in the corner of your eye becomes a figure. A fleeting sound turns into a voice. And what was once clear becomes clouded in confusion. Combine that with the stress of constant combat, the tension of never knowing what the next moment might bring, and you have a recipe for the mind to fracture. The human brain, under extreme duress, has a tendency to overcompensate, to seek patterns where none exist. What the soldiers saw, heard, and felt may have been the result of this very breakdown. But was it really that simple? Or was there something more to the unexplainable? Then there's the environment. The desert is an unforgiving place, and its effects on the human body go beyond just the heat. The dry air, the constant exposure to extreme temperatures. This environment can alter the way a person experiences the world. The sandstorms, the swirling dust, can disorient and distort vision. The heat can cause mirages. And the stillness of the night can play tricks on the ears, causing the faintest sounds to be amplified, turning a whisper into a shout. Could this be what they were facing? A combination of environmental stressors that distorted their perceptions and pushed them further into the unknown? Or perhaps it was a different kind of force at work. Could there be something deeper, something more calculated behind these experiences? What if the very fear that gripped the soldiers wasn't entirely their own? In times of conflict, psychological operations are often employed to destabilize the enemy. The lines between fact and fiction blur in the chaos of war, and psychological warfare is no exception. What if the unsettling phenomena weren't just the product of the soldiers' minds, but part of a deliberate tactic designed to unnerve and disorient them? As improbable as it might sound, there's a history of enemy forces using psychological tactics to manipulate the perception of troops. In the heat of battle, when the mind is already stretched to its limits, every sound, every shadow becomes a potential threat. What if the whispers, the figures, and the haunting lights weren't random? What if they were engineered to break down the soldiers, to plant seeds of doubt, to erode their will and force them to question everything they knew? Could it be possible that the enemy wasn't just on the other side of the line, but already inside their minds? Many skeptics would argue that the mind, when pushed too far, will create its own answers. Experts in human perception, particularly under extreme duress, will tell you that hallucinations are common in high-stress environments. They'll tell you that the mind will seek comfort in anything it can latch onto, and in a place as isolated and hostile as Observation Point Rock, the need to find meaning in the madness could easily tip the balance. But as any soldier will tell you, sometimes there's more to it than meets the eye. Even the most skeptical among them can't deny that what they experienced felt real. And for some, the truth might be that the greatest battle is the one waged in the mind. Imagine, if you will, standing on the edge of a foreign land, one where history isn't just told in books, but woven into the very fabric of the earth itself. A place where the whispers of the past still echo in the wind, carried on the shoulders of those who lived and died long before you. For the soldiers stationed at Observation Point Rock, the land of Afghanistan held more than just strategic value. It was a place of deep, layered beliefs. And for the men who set foot there, those beliefs quickly became more than folklore. They became a reality that gnawed at their psyche relentlessly. Afghanistan, a land steeped in culture, is also a place where beliefs about spirits, jinns, and cursed lands have been passed down for centuries. These beliefs aren't just stories told around campfires, they are deeply rooted in the hearts and minds of the people. Spirits, sometimes benevolent, sometimes vengeful, are said to wander the earth. Jinns, invisible but ever-present, are said to interact with the living in ways both terrifying and mysterious. And there are lands, places considered cursed by generations of locals, where few dare to tread, where the very soil itself is believed to hold the weight of an ancient curse. For the soldiers stationed in these remote outposts, the culture of the land, rich in its traditions and legends, wasn't something they could ignore. These beliefs, though foreign to many of them, were not far removed from their experiences. And when unexplained phenomena began to unfold, when the voices, the lights, the chilling sensations grew stronger, the lines between local lore and the soldiers' own encounters started to blur. Perhaps they had always known it was possible, being soldiers trained to endure the harshest realities. But even they had to confront the unexplainable, to wrestle with the discomfort of what they couldn't see or understand. As they struggled to make sense of their experiences, these encounters took on a different meaning when filtered through the cultural lens of Afghanistan. What they experienced was no longer just the mind playing tricks. It was something else entirely, something embedded in the land, in the people's stories, in the very air they breathed. The villagers, living on the edge of these troubled lands, had long whispered about the unseen forces that roamed their world. Their stories, passed down through countless generations, carried with them a weight that was hard to dismiss. To them, the land was not just dirt and rock. It was alive with forces that could not be ignored. And so, when soldiers began to feel their hearts race, when they heard whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, or saw figures moving in the corner of their eyes, it wasn't just fear they were experiencing, it was a validation of everything they had heard in those dark corners of the camp. The Afghan perspective on hauntings and the paranormal differs from the Western understanding, where ghosts are often seen as lingering spirits of the dead, tied to unresolved matters. Here, the supernatural is not always so linear. It's more cyclical, more entrenched in the fabric of daily life. Spirits don't just haunt, they exist, intertwining with the lives of those who dwell in their realm. Jinns are not just mythical beings. They are entities capable of influencing human behavior, sometimes good, but often malevolent. To the locals, it wasn't just a matter of seeing something out of the ordinary, it was an invitation to confront the unknown, to acknowledge a reality that was beyond their comprehension. For the soldiers, raised in a world where reason and logic prevailed, the cultural divide was impossible to ignore. As their experiences began to mirror the very things the locals had warned them about, the soldiers had to question everything they thought they knew. Was it the exhaustion playing tricks on their minds? Was it a product of fear, exacerbated by the constant stress of war? Or was there something else, something deep-rooted in the land, something the locals had always known, that now sought to make itself known to the soldiers? As they stood there, amidst the heavy silence of the Afghan landscape, the soldiers realized that the very culture of the place, its legends, its myths, and its beliefs, was not just a backdrop to their mission. It was an integral part of their experience. The tension between what they had been taught to believe and what they were now forced to confront was perhaps the most terrifying part of all. Observation Point Rock. It sits there still as if time itself forgot to touch it. Once a strategic post in a war-torn land, now just a forgotten relic. But is it truly abandoned? Or does it still carry with it the weight of the untold stories, lingering in the quiet corners of its crumbling walls? There's something unnerving about the way it stands there, untouched by the years that have passed. The echoes of footsteps, of hurried whispers and hurried breaths, still seem to bounce off the jagged edges of the rocks. But no one is there now, at least not in the way they once were. Some say that Observation Point Rock still remains as it was left, the remnants of a forgotten mission abandoned long ago. Others believe nature has taken back what was never meant to stand in the first place. Yet, there are those who claim that it continues to exist as a watchful presence, almost as if it's waiting for the next chapter to unfold. As if the stories left behind in the silence of those who once stood there are not finished. They're simply paused. Whatever its state may be today, the haunting tales associated with Observation Point Rock have not faded into oblivion. No, they have been passed down like a shadow, cast over the men who once served there. These stories, the strange happenings, the unexplained occurrences, have found their way into the halls of military circles, spreading from one generation to the next. What was once a whispered account becomes a chilling cautionary tale, a shared experience among soldiers, regardless of time or place. The power of these tales lies not only in the unknown, but in what they reveal about the very nature of war. The unseen scars. The toll it takes on the mind, on perception, on reality itself. What do we do with those experiences we can't explain? How do we reconcile them with the reality we've been trained to believe in? These accounts, strange as they may seem, are not just about the unexplained forces that haunt a place. They're a reflection of the deeper, more painful wounds carried within the human psyche. For the soldiers, these stories became more than mere rumors or whispers. They were the manifestation of something far more profound. The trauma that could not be quantified, the experiences that couldn't be understood. The eyes of the men who returned from those missions told a different story than the one in the official reports. What they had encountered in the remote desolation of Afghanistan was not just the enemy they could see, but something far more elusive, more dangerous. The darkness within themselves and within the land they had been sent to conquer. Even now, long after the last mission, long after the last shot was fired, Observation Point Rock remains an enigma. Not because it is physically present, but because the memories and the fears it invoked still linger in the minds of those who were there. These tales have taken on a life of their own, growing and evolving with each telling, until they have become a part of something far larger than any single soldier or any single event. And so, as the years pass, these experiences continue to shape the understanding of what it means to be a soldier, to fight, to survive. They weave their way into the collective consciousness, not just as stories of ghosts or haunted places, but as stories of survival, of the unexplainable truths that reside deep within the human spirit. Observation Point Rock, abandoned or not, remains a silent sentinel. It is not just a place on the map, it is a place in the minds of those who lived through it, and those who still carry it with them every day. In the end, the haunting tales tied to Observation Point Rock will forever remain an indelible part of the lore of war. They are a reminder that some scars, those that can't be seen, those that linger in the quiet corners of the mind, can never truly be erased. As long as there are those who remember, the mystery of Observation Point Rock will endure.